destroy the future.
You don't know what it's like to try to kill one of these things.
Protect it.
Come with me if you want to live.
His loyalty is to a child.
Who sent you?
You did.
Is the deadliest machine ever built.
You just can't go around.
Look again.
Oh, now!
This time, he's back. For good.
Trust me.
Terminator 2, Judgment Day.
Terminator 2, Judgment Day, 1991. Complete analysis and explanations. Introduction, a landmark in cinema history. When Terminator 2, Judgment Day was released on July 3, 1991, it fundamentally altered the landscape of science fiction and action filmmaking. Directed by James Cameron, who co-wrote the screenplay with William Wisher, the film represented a quantum leap forward in terms of visual effects, storytelling ambition, and franchise evolution. With a budget of $94 to $102 million, it became the most expensive film ever made at the time. A gamble that paid off spectacularly, grossing $519 to $520.9 million worldwide and becoming the highest-grossing film of 1991. Cultural significance and preservation. The film's significance extends far beyond its commercial success. In 2023, the United States Library of Congress selected Terminator 2 for preservation in the National Film Registry, recognizing its cultural, historical, and aesthetic importance. The consensus among critics and audiences alike is that this sequel not only equals, but arguably surpasses its predecessor. A rare achievement that places it in the pantheon of the greatest sequels ever made, a film that redefined what a summer blockbuster could achieve on both a technical and emotional level. The setup, a future war revisited. The narrative opens by re-establishing the grim mythology of the original film. In the year 2029, Earth lies ravaged by a war between the malevolent artificial intelligence Skynet and the human resistance led by John Connor. Skynet, desperate to alter the course of history, sends a new and more advanced Terminator, the T-1000, back in time to 1995 to kill John Connor as a child. The resistance responds by sending back a reprogrammed T-800 Terminator, the same model that attempted to kill John's mother Sarah in 1984, now repurposed as a protector. This reversal of roles forms the core of the film's dramatic irony. Act 1. Converging on John Connor. In 1995 Los Angeles, we find Sarah Connor incarcerated at Pescadero State Hospital. Her warnings about Judgment Day, the prophesied nuclear holocaust of August 29, 1997, have led doctors to diagnose her as delusional. Her 10-year-old son John, played by Edward Furlong, lives with foster parents and resents his mother's obsessive preparations for his future role as humanity's leader. This setup establishes a fractured family dynamic that the film will spend its runtime attempting to heal, showcasing a child burdened by a destiny he barely understands. The mall encounter and the shift in dynamics. The T-1000 Robert Patrick, a shape-shifting liquid metal Terminator, locates John in a shopping mall. However, the reprogrammed T-800, Arnold Schwarzenegger, arrives moments earlier, protecting John and enabling his escape. The mall sequence serves as the film's thesis statement. It introduces the two opposing forces of technology and recontextualizes the iconography of the first film. Recognizing that the T-800 is programmed to obey him, John forbids it from killing and orders it to help rescue his mother, immediately establishing a moral boundary that distinguishes this narrative from its predecessor's nihilism. Act 2. The Unlikely Family. The T-800 and John intercept Sarah during her escape attempt. Initially horrified, this machine wears the face of her former tormentor. Sarah eventually joins them, fleeing from the relentless T-1000. The film now transforms into a road movie about an unconventional family unit. Using the T-800's knowledge of the future, Sarah learns that Miles Dyson, Joe Morton, a Cyberdyne engineer, is developing a revolutionary microprocessor based on reverse-engineered technology from the original Terminator's remains. This reveals the film's central paradox. This technology will ultimately lead to Skynet's creation. The bonding process and emotional education. Throughout their journey, Sarah witnesses the T-800 forming a bond with John, serving as a friend and surrogate father figure. John teaches the machine catchphrases, "Hasta la vista, baby," hand signs, and the value of human life, lessons that will have profound consequences. This educational arc is crucial. It transforms the T-800 from a mere machine into a tabula rasa onto which John projects his ideals of masculinity and morality. The film suggests that humanity is not an innate quality but a learned behavior, one that even a cyborg can acquire. Act 3. Judgment Day averted. Sarah initially plans to assassinate Dyson, but relents when confronted by her son. The T-800 explains the future consequences of Dyson's work, and the engineer agrees to help destroy his life's work. During a raid on Cyberdyne headquarters, Dyson sacrifices himself to detonate the explosives that destroy the lab. This sequence represents the film's moral turning point. Sarah's violent militarism is rejected in favor of collective sacrifice, suggesting that humanity's salvation lies not in preemptive violence, but in cooperation and redemption. The steel mill climax. The T-1000 pursues the survivors to a steel mill, a location that serves as an industrial cathedral for the final confrontation. This environment, filled with molten metal and heavy machinery, symbolizes the industrial hell that Skynet intends to create. After Sarah and John manage to push the T-1000 into a vat of molten steel, the T-800 explains that it too must be destroyed. Its own technology could become the foundation for Skynet. Despite John's tearful protests, the T-800 gives a final thumbs up as it is lowered into the steel, incinerating itself to ensure humanity's future. The ending, hope restored. As Sarah drives down a highway with John, she reflects on her newfound hope. If a machine can learn the value of human life, maybe we can too. The film ends with the possibility that Judgment Day has been averted, leaving the future unwritten and full of possibility. This final monologue reframes the entire narrative, It is no longer a story about preventing a specific apocalypse, but about the potential for human growth and change, mirroring the machine's own transformation. Thematic analysis. The father figure and the search for role models. Central to Terminator 2 is the relationship between John Connor and the T-800, which serves as a surrogate for the father John never knew, Kyle Reese, who died in the first film. James Cameron explicitly compared this dynamic to the Tin Man receiving a heart in The Wizard of Oz, emphasizing that the film's emotional core matters more than its action sequences. In the context of 1991, a time when essayist Robert Bly wrote about the lack of suitable male role models for young men, the T-800 steps in to fill a void left by absent and failing human men. The archetype of the Tin Man, Cameron stated. Sure, there's going to be big, thunderous action sequences, but the heart of the movie is that relationship. The T-800, designed purely for infiltration and termination, evolves throughout the film, learning from John to feel grief, compassion, and ultimately the willingness to sacrifice itself for others. This character arc transforms the T-800 from a killing machine into something approaching humanity. The film portrays the search for a role model not as a return to traditional patriarchy, but as the forging of a new, empathetic form of strength. Sarah Connor, from victim to warrior. Linda Hamilton's transformation between the first and second films is remarkable. The Sarah Connor of the Terminator was a frightened young woman thrust into extraordinary circumstances. The Sarah Connor of Terminator 2 is a hardened, muscle-bound soldier who has spent years preparing for apocalypse. Cameron described her as a sad character, a tragic character. She believes that everyone she meets, talks to, or interacts with will be dead very soon. Her physical strength is a manifestation of her psychological armor, maternal terror, and moral crisis. This psychological damage is evident throughout the film. Sarah's nightmare sequence, depicting a nuclear explosion consuming a playground where she plays with her son, represents one of cinema's most powerful depictions of maternal terror and apocalyptic anxiety. Her obsession with preventing Judgment Day has made her less human even as she fights to preserve humanity. Yet the film does not simply celebrate Sarah's transformation. Her plan to assassinate Miles Dyson in his home, surrounded by his family, represents a moral crisis. The film critiques her dehumanization even as it acknowledges the trauma that produced it. The T-1000, the police officer as nightmare. James Cameron and William Wisher made a deliberate choice to have the T-1000 appear as a police officer. This was thematically significant. They believed it represented humans who should have empathy for others becoming more machine-like and detached from their emotions. The T-1000's uniform grants it authority and trust, allowing it to move through society while committing murder. This serves as a critique of institutional power and the ways authority figures can abuse their positions, presenting law enforcement not as a source of safety, but as an instrument of relentless, amoral pursuit. Race and institutional violence. A particularly striking sequence occurs when a SWAT team raids Miles Dyson's home. The officers shoot Dyson, an African-American engineer, without warning. Critics have noted that Dyson serves as the most human character in the film, an intelligent, optimistic family man whose work is motivated by a genuine desire to advance technology. This scene represents real-world encounters between police forces and people of color, contrasted with the earlier encounter between the same SWAT team and the Caucasian T-800, during which they warn him before opening fire. This moment adds a layer of social commentary that enriches the film's themes of institutional violence and prejudice. The paradox of technology. Terminator 2 embeds itself in a classic science fiction paradox. The future technology sent back in time catalyzes the creation of the very technology that causes the trouble in the first place. The Cyberdyne microprocessor is reverse-engineered from the remains of the 1984 Terminator, meaning that Skynet's attempt to kill Sarah Connor inadvertently provided the means for its own eventual creation. This causal loop raises profound questions about fate, determinism, and humanity's relationship with its own creations. Breaking the cycle of violence. The film suggests that violence begets violence, and that attempts to control the future through technological means are doomed to self-destruction. The T-800's final sacrifice is significant because it represents a break in this loop. Unlike the original Terminator, which fought to survive, this machine chooses to die. Only by breaking the cycle, by choosing sacrifice over survival, can humanity hope to escape its programmed fate. The film argues that true strength lies not in perpetuating the cycle of technological escalation, but in ending it. Character analysis: the T-800. Arnold Schwarzenegger's return as the Terminator represented a radical reimagining of the character. The original film's Terminator was a relentless villain. In Terminator 2, the same model becomes the protagonist. This inversion allowed Schwarzenegger to demonstrate comedic timing and emotional depth absent from his previous roles. Many critics consider this his finest performance, as he manages to convey the awakening of consciousness through subtle physical gestures and a gradual softening of his mechanical demeanor. The machine learning humanity. The T-800's development arc follows the classic machine learning humanity trajectory. Initially programmed with basic commands, it gradually acquires catchphrases, understands slang, no problemo, and learns to smile, resulting in one of cinema's most memorable awkward grins. By the film's conclusion, it chooses sacrifice, demonstrating an understanding of love and loss that transcends its programming. This arc is visually represented by the transition from the cold, blue lighting of the future war to the warm, amber tones of its interactions with John. Character analysis: Sarah Connor. Linda Hamilton's portrayal of Sarah Connor represents one of cinema's most significant female action hero performances. She trained rigorously for the role, building muscle mass and learning tactical maneuvers. The character's physical transformation mirrors her psychological journey. She has become the warrior necessary to survive the coming war, but at the cost of her warmth and humanity. The film allows Sarah to recover some of that humanity through her relationship with John and the T-800. Her final monologue, musing that if a machine can learn the value of life, perhaps humanity can too, completes her arc from traumatized survivor to hopeful prophet. Character analysis: John Connor. Edward Furlong, in his film debut, brings authenticity and vulnerability to the role of John Connor. This is not a hardened future leader, but a troubled boy, a petty delinquent with a heart, longing for his absent mother and the father he never knew. His relationship with the T-800 provides the emotional anchor of the film. John serves as the moral center, teaching both the T-800 and his mother about the sanctity of life. When he forbids the T-800 from killing, it establishes the ethical framework that distinguishes the film from its predecessor. The tragedy of forced maturity. The tragedy of the ending, John's desperate plea, "I order you not to go," followed by the T-800's sacrificial choice, resonates because of the genuine bond established throughout the narrative. For John, this represents the loss of the only stable father figure he has ever known. His grief is not just for a protector, but for a friend who validated his humanity. This moment forces John to grow up, accepting the burden of leadership not through violence, but through the pain of necessary loss. Character analysis: the T-1000. Robert Patrick's T-1000 represents a breakthrough in villain design. Unlike the T-800's brute force approach, the T-1000 is lithe, fast, and eerily calm. Patrick studied Birds of Prey to develop the character's relentless, focused movement. The T-1000 never runs. It moves at a constant, terrifyingly efficient pace, never tiring, never stopping. This creates a sense of inevitability. No matter how fast the protagonists flee, the T-1000 is always there, just behind them, an unstoppable force of nature. The horror of the mimic. The character's shape-shifting abilities, the result of groundbreaking visual effects, make it a nightmare adversary. It can mimic anyone it touches, turn its arms into blades, and flow through bars. Yet its most frightening quality is its affectlessness. The T-1000's blank expression, whether it is killing or waiting in line at a convenience store, suggests a complete absence of human emotion, the logical endpoint of the machine-like humans Cameron critiques. It represents the ultimate assimilation of technology into society, hiding in plain sight. Character analysis: Miles Dyson. Joe Morton's Miles Dyson provides the film's tragic heart. He is not a villain. He is an engineer genuinely excited by his discoveries, unaware of the apocalyptic consequences of his work. When confronted with the truth, he immediately agrees to destroy his life's work, sacrificing himself to correct his unwitting error. His death, gunned down by police as he triggers the explosives, carries an extra weight given the film's commentary on race and institutional violence. Dyson's arc suggests that redemption is possible even for those who unknowingly contribute to destruction. Visual effects and technical innovation, ILM's breakthrough. Terminator 2 revolutionized visual effects through its collaboration with Industrial Light and Magic, ILM. The film represents the first use of a computer-generated main character in a blockbuster film. The T-1000's liquid metal form required pioneering CGI techniques. The effects team faced unprecedented challenges. The T-1000 had to appear to flow, transform, and reform in ways that blended seamlessly with live-action footage. ILM developed new software specifically for the film, creating effects that remain impressive decades later. Practical effects and Stan Winston's legacy. While CGI received the most attention, practical effects remained crucial. Stan Winston's studio created the T-800's endoskeleton, the T-1000's practical effects, and numerous animatronic elements. The combination of practical and digital effects allowed Cameron to create a seamless world where machines felt physically present. The melting and reforming of the T-1000, achieved through a mix of practical prosthetics and digital compositing, set a new standard for what was possible in visual storytelling. Cinematography and visual language. Adam Greenberg's cinematography gives the film a distinctive visual identity. The use of blue and silver tones for the T-1000, warm amber for the T-800, and desaturated colors for the apocalyptic sequences creates a visual language that reinforces the film's themes. The camera often adopts the perspective of the machines, cold, tracking, relentless, before cutting to the vulnerable human characters. This shifting perspective aligns the audience with the machine protagonists while reminding us of the fragility of the human subjects. Sound design and Brad Fiedel's score. Brad Fiedel's electronic score, built around the iconic metallic percussion and synthesizer pulses, remains one of cinema's most recognizable soundtracks. The sound design emphasizes the difference between the machines, the T-800's heavy, mechanical movements versus the T-1000's liquid, near-silent flow, while the industrial percussion of the main theme evokes the clanking of machinery and the heartbeat of a dying world. The score's rhythmic, heartbeat-like pulse gives the film a relentless momentum that mirrors the T-1000's pursuit. Critical reception and contemporary reviews. Upon release, Terminator 2 received overwhelming critical acclaim. The film holds a 93% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, with the critical consensus praising the performances, action sequences, and groundbreaking visual effects. Critics universally praise the film's ability to balance spectacle with emotional depth. One reviewer noted, "It's not just an action movie. It is an action movie, yes. But what makes it the grandest action movie ever is that it's got heart. It hits you hard and leaves you thinking for ages afterwards." Accolades and box office performance. The film won 4 Academy Awards: Best Sound Editing, Best Sound Mixing, Best Makeup, and Best Visual Effects. It also received BAFTA Awards, Saturn Awards, and the Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation. Grossing $519 to $520.9 million worldwide, Terminator 2 became the highest-grossing film of 1991 and the third highest-grossing film of its time. It held the record for the highest-grossing R-rated film until The Matrix Reloaded surpassed it in 2003, demonstrating that mature, adult-oriented science fiction could achieve mainstream dominance. Influence on cinema. Terminator 2 is considered a major influence on visual effects in film, helping usher in the transition from practical effects to reliance on computer-generated imagery. The Visual Effects Society named it one of the 50 most influential visual effects films of all time. Its success demonstrated that sequels could not only match but surpass their predecessors, setting new standards for franchise filmmaking. It established the template for the modern blockbuster sequel. Bigger, more expensive, but also more emotionally complex than the original. Cultural impact and iconography. The film has generated an extensive array of merchandise, including video games, comic books, novels, and the Universal Studios attraction T2-3D, Battle Across Time. Lines such as "Hasta la vista, baby," and "I'll be back," reprised from the first film, have entered popular culture. The image of the T-800 giving a thumbs up as it descends into molten steel remains one of cinema's most iconic and emotionally resonant final images, representing the ultimate act of sacrifice and the triumph of learned humanity over programmed destruction. Alternate versions and extended cut, theatrical versus extended. The theatrical version runs 137 minutes, while the extended cut, sometimes called the special edition or director's cut, adds approximately 16 minutes of additional footage. The extended version includes several significant scenes that deepen the characterizations. The chip switch scene, where the T-800 requires John to remove its CPU to switch it from read-only to learn mode, explicitly establishes its capacity for learning, making its later emotional development less ambiguous. Deleted scenes and the alternate ending. The extended cut also features a dream sequence of Kyle Reese, where Sarah envisions him warning her about the future, deepening her connection to John's father and her sense of loss. Additional scenes showing the T-1000 malfunctioning after being frozen and shattered demonstrate its vulnerability, adding texture to its seemingly invincible nature. The extended version also features an alternate ending set in 2029, where an elderly Sarah Connor watches her son John, now a U.S. Senator, playing with his daughter in a park, explicitly showing that Judgment Day was averted. Cameron's choice of ambiguity. Cameron ultimately chose the more ambiguous theatrical ending, which preserves the tension and allows the audience to hope without certainty. This decision was crucial. It respects the film's themes of free will and an unwritten future. By removing the explicit happy ending, Cameron ensured that the film's final message was about possibility rather than predestination, allowing the audience to walk out of the theater with the same hope Sarah expresses in her monologue. The franchise legacy, sequels, and continuations. Although Cameron intended Terminator 2 to conclude the story, the franchise continued with multiple sequels. Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines, 2003, Terminator Salvation, 2009, Terminator Genesis, 2015, and the television series Terminator, The Sarah Connor Chronicles. Each of these sequels attempted to recapture the magic of the first two films, but most struggled to move beyond the shadow of the 1991 masterpiece, often retreading its themes of sacrifice and the father-son dynamic. Terminator, Dark Fate and the Return to Canon. In 2019 Terminator, Dark Fate was released with Cameron's involvement as producer. This film serves as a direct sequel to Terminator 2, ignoring the events of all intervening sequels. It reunited Cameron with Linda Hamilton and attempted to recapture the spirit of the original films, though it underperformed commercially. Dark Fate reaffirmed the enduring power of the Sarah Connor character and the specific emotional resonance of the 1991 film, but also highlighted the difficulty of continuing a story that had already achieved thematic closure. Enduring relevance, AI and nuclear anxiety. Terminator 2 continues to be rediscovered by new generations. A 3D 4K re-release in 2017 topped the UK box office, demonstrating the film's enduring appeal. The film's themes, artificial intelligence, nuclear anxiety, the nature of humanity, remain as relevant today as they were in 1991, perhaps even more so in an era of accelerating technological development. In a world increasingly concerned with autonomous weapons and the unchecked growth of AI, the cautionary tale of Skynet has transformed from science fiction into a pressing contemporary warning. The question of free will versus determinism. One of the film's deepest philosophical inquiries concerns the nature of fate. The original film operated on a closed-loop theory of time travel. Events were predetermined. Terminator 2, however, introduces the possibility of altering the future. The destruction of Cyberdyne and the T-800's sacrifice suggest that the future is not set. This shift from fatalism to existentialism empowers the characters. They are no longer pawns of destiny, but agents of their own creation, capable of rewriting the script of history. The rejection of nihilism. Whereas the first film ended on a note of ominous inevitability, Sarah driving into a storm, pregnant with the future leader, Terminator 2 ends on a note of cautious optimism. This rejection of nihilism is central to the film's enduring appeal. It suggests that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable technological and institutional forces, human connection and sacrifice can prevail. The film offers a humanist counter-narrative to the cold logic of machines and the Cold War anxieties of its time. Visual symbolism, fire and water. Cameron employs elemental symbolism throughout the film to distinguish between the machines and the humans. Fire represents destruction and the industrial might of Skynet, the nuclear fire of Judgment Day, the flames of the Cyberdyne explosion. Water, conversely, is associated with transformation and rebirth. The T-1000 is shattered by liquid nitrogen and reformed in heat, while the T-800 descends into molten metal. Sarah's dream begins in fire, the playground burning, but the film ends with her driving into the rain, a symbol of cleansing and renewal. The role of dreams and prophecy. The film uses dreams not just as character exposition, but as narrative drivers. Sarah's nightmares are warnings from the future that keep her militant obsession alive. However, the film also shows the danger of being consumed by prophecy. When Sarah dreams of Kyle Reese, it is a moment of clarity that reminds her of love rather than war. The dreams in Terminator 2 function as a double-edged sword. They provide necessary information but also threaten to strip the dreamer of their humanity. The police state and surveillance. Beyond the specific imagery of the T-1000 as a cop, the film is suffused with a broader anxiety about surveillance and state control. The T-800 warns Sarah that her phone calls are monitored. The police are consistently hostile to the protagonists, and the psychiatric institution represents a system designed to silence dissenting voices. This was prescient for 1991, anticipating modern concerns about the erosion of privacy and the militarization of police forces, which have only intensified in the decades since the film's release. Masculinity and violence. The film offers a nuanced critique of traditional masculinity. The human men in Sarah's past are failures. John's foster father is an abusive drunk, and the various boyfriends Sarah mentions are inadequate. In contrast, the T-800, a machine, represents a form of masculinity that is protective, patient, and ultimately self-sacrificing. However, the film complicates this by showing that the T-800's initial model of masculinity, violent, stoic, must be softened by John's influence, suggesting that the ideal father figure is one who listens and learns rather than one who simply dominates. Linda Hamilton's performance as physical transformation. Linda Hamilton's commitment to the role went beyond mere physical training. She endured a grueling regimen of weightlifting and combat training to achieve the sinewy, hardened physique of a soldier. This physicality is central to the character's believability. The audience must believe that this Sarah Connor could survive in a war zone. Her transformation also serves as a visual metaphor for the toll that trauma and obsession take on the human body, turning her into a living weapon while simultaneously scarred by her mission. Arnold Schwarzenegger's redemption arc. For Schwarzenegger, Terminator 2 represented a crucial career evolution. Having been typecast as a muscle-bound villain or action hero, here he was asked to play a character who was simultaneously a ruthless machine and a gentle father figure. His comedic timing, particularly in scenes where he is learning to smile or attempting to mimic human behavior, showed a range he had rarely been allowed to display. The film effectively redeemed the Terminator character, transforming it from a symbol of unstoppable terror into one of heroic sacrifice. The importance of the extended cut for character depth. While the theatrical cut is masterful, the extended cut provides valuable context for the character's motivations. The scene where John and Sarah remove the T-800 CPU to switch it to learn mode makes the machine's later emotional development more logical and less abstract. It explicitly tells the audience that this Terminator is different from the one in the first film because it is capable of learning. This scene is crucial for understanding the film's central theme, that humanity is not a fixed state but a capacity for growth. Robert Patrick's physical performance. Robert Patrick's performance as the T-1000 is often cited as one of the great villainous turns in cinema history. His physicality was key. He ran without blinking, held his breath to eliminate the rise and fall of his chest, and trained to run at full sprint without appearing to tire. This gave the character an inhuman quality that CGI alone could not provide. Patrick's commitment to making the T-1000 seem less than human highlights the humanity of the T-800, creating a dichotomy where the bulky machine seems more relatable than the sleek, perfect one. The steel mill as a symbolic battleground. The final confrontation in the steel mill is a masterclass in thematic staging. The environment is industrial, hellish, and filled with molten metal, the very elements of Skynet's creation. By destroying the T-1000 in a vat of steel, the protagonists are essentially destroying the raw material of their enemy. For the T-800, the steel mill represents a return to its origins. It is destroyed by the same industrial process that created it. The setting brings the film's technological themes full circle, ending the battle in the belly of the beast. The thumbs up, a gesture of love. The T-800's final thumbs up is one of the most emotionally devastating moments in action cinema. Throughout the film, John has been teaching the Terminator how to be human, how to smile, how to use slang, how to bond. The thumbs up is a gesture John taught him earlier as a sign of approval. When the T-800 uses it as he descends into the steel, it is not a mechanical function. It is a deliberate act of communication, a final lesson in humanity. It signifies that the machine has learned what John wanted to teach it: how to love. The film's anti-nuclear stance. Embedded within the sci-fi action is a clear anti-nuclear message. Sarah's nightmare of the playground burning is a direct response to the Cold War anxieties of the 1980s and early 1990s. The film was released just years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, at a moment when the world was reassessing its relationship with nuclear weapons. Terminator 2 argues that the real threat is not an external enemy, but our own technological arrogance. The enemy is not Russia or any nation. The enemy is the unchecked development of autonomous, destructive systems. The moral complexity of violence. Unlike many action films of its era, Terminator 2 is deeply ambivalent about violence. John consistently forbids the T-800 from killing, and the film takes pains to show that the security guards at Cyberdyne are wounded, not killed. The only deaths that occur are those of the T-800, a machine, and Miles Dyson, whose death is portrayed as a tragedy, not a victory. This moral restraint was unusual for a blockbuster in 1991 and contributes to the film's ethical depth. It suggests that killing, even in a just cause, has consequences. Maternal protection versus maternal obsession. Sarah Connor's arc explores the fine line between maternal protection and dangerous obsession. Her love for John is what drives her to escape the hospital and fight against Skynet. However, that same love nearly drives her to murder an innocent man in front of his family. The film suggests that love, when perverted by fear and trauma, can become destructive. Sarah's recovery is not just about saving the world. It is about reclaiming a form of motherhood that is based on nurturing rather than pure survivalism. The futility of revenge. A key subtext of the film is the futility of revenge. Sarah spends years preparing for a war that hasn't happened yet, obsessed with the machines that destroyed her life. When she finally confronts Dyson, she realizes that revenge against a man who is merely a cog in the machine is meaningless. The film advocates for breaking the cycle of vengeance, embodied by the T-800 sacrifice. By choosing to end its existence, the machine refuses to perpetuate the violence that created it, offering a model of peace over retribution. The influence of 1980s cyberpunk. Terminator 2 draws heavily from the cyberpunk genre, which explored the fusion of man and machine and the dangers of corporate control. The Cyberdyne Corporation represents the unchecked power of private industry to develop technologies that threaten the species. Miles Dyson, like many cyberpunk protagonists, is a brilliant engineer who realizes too late the consequences of his creations. The film's aesthetic, neon lights, gritty urban environments, and high-tech low-life contrasts places it firmly within the cyberpunk tradition. The film's legacy in visual effects history. From a technical standpoint, Terminator 2 stands as a watershed moment in visual effects history. It marked the first time a fully CGI character interacted with live-action environments for extended sequences. The techniques developed for the T-1000, particularly the use of morphing technology and reflective surfaces, laid the groundwork for the digital effects revolution of the 1990s. Without Terminator 2, films like Jurassic Park and The Matrix might not have been possible, as it proved that audiences would accept computer-generated imagery as a legitimate storytelling tool. Conclusion: why Terminator 2 endures. Terminator 2, Judgment Day represents a rare achievement, a sequel that expands upon its predecessor in every conceivable dimension while maintaining artistic integrity. James Cameron and his collaborators created a film that works simultaneously as a visceral action experience, a thoughtful science fiction meditation, and an emotionally resonant family drama. The film's genius lies in its inversions. The villain becomes the hero, the machine learns to love, the traumatized survivor learns to hope. It asks profound questions about fate, free will, and what it means to be human, all while delivering some of the most spectacular action sequences ever filmed. Final reflections on humanity and hope. The T-800's final line, "I know now why you cry, but it is something I can never do," encapsulates the film's emotional power. A machine, designed for termination, sacrifices itself so that humanity can live. In doing so, it demonstrates a capacity for love that some humans have lost. The film suggests that humanity's future depends not on superior technology, but on our ability to learn what the Terminator learns: that life has value, that sacrifice matters, and that hope is worth preserving. 30 years after its release, Terminator 2, Judgment Day remains a landmark of science fiction cinema. A film that redefined what action movies could achieve and continues to inspire filmmakers and audiences alike. The deconstruction of the action hero archetype. James Cameron deliberately dismantles the conventional action hero template by positioning Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator as a character who must learn pacifism rather than violence. The film presents a protagonist whose greatest strength ultimately becomes his willingness to cease functioning, a radical departure from the genre's typical emphasis on indestructible masculinity. This deconstruction extends to the film's treatment of weaponry, where the T-800's arsenal is gradually abandoned in favor of non-lethal interventions and strategic retreats. Cameron subverts audience expectations by having the physically imposing figure repeatedly refuse to kill, even when doing so would simplify his mission. The machine's journey from termination to protection mirrors a broader cultural shift away from the uncomplicated heroism of 1980s action cinema toward more nuanced, emotionally intelligent forms of strength. The philosophical implications of read-only versus learning mode. The extended cut's crucial scene involving the T-800's CPU switch from read-only to learning mode carries profound philosophical weight regarding determinism and free will. In read-only mode, the Terminator operates as a slave to its programming, executing commands without interpretation or growth, representing a purely mechanistic existence. Once switched to learning mode, the machine gains the capacity to adapt, question, and ultimately transcend its original purpose, mirroring humanity's own struggle against biological and social determinism. This binary between static programming and adaptive intelligence reflects contemporary debates in artificial intelligence about whether true consciousness requires the ability to modify one's own foundational code. Cameron suggests that humanity's salvation lies not in rigid adherence to programming, whether that programming is genetic, cultural, or technological, but in the willingness to embrace change and uncertainty. Sarah Connor's institutionalization as social critique. The opening sequences depicting Sarah Connor's incarceration at Pescadero State Hospital function as a scathing critique of how society silences those who speak uncomfortable truths. Sarah's transformation into a physical powerhouse is contrasted with her powerlessness within the psychiatric system, where her knowledge of the future is pathologized as paranoid delusion. The hospital represents society's mechanism for neutralizing threats to the status quo, drugging and imprisoning individuals whose understanding outstrips the mainstream's capacity for belief. Dr. Silberman, returning from the first film, embodies the arrogance of institutional authority, dismissing Sarah's trauma as fantasy while remaining blind to the apocalyptic reality approaching. Cameron draws a direct line between the hospital's methods of control and the broader societal tendency to discredit prophets and visionaries, suggesting that the same forces that dismiss Sarah will ultimately enable Skynet's creation through willful ignorance. The foster system and failed institutions. John Connor's life with foster parents reveals a broader institutional failure that runs parallel to the film's technological anxieties. The foster system, like the psychiatric hospital and the police force, represents another structure meant to protect that instead fails those in its care. John's foster father is depicted as neglectful and potentially abusive, creating a home environment so devoid of affection that a reprogrammed killing machine becomes a preferable guardian. This critique of institutional care underscores the film's argument that humanity's problems are not merely technological, but deeply social, rooted in the erosion of authentic human connection. John's delinquency, stealing from ATMs, disrupting traffic, is framed not as inherent criminality, but as a response to abandonment, a search for control in a world where no adult has provided consistent guidance. The T-1000's existential horror. Beyond its function as an antagonist, the T-1000 embodies existential horror concepts that resonate deeply with philosophical inquiries into identity and selfhood. The entity has no fixed form, no consistent appearance, and arguably no continuous consciousness, raising questions about whether such a being can be said to have a self at all. Its ability to mimic others perfectly suggests a terrifying void at its core, a being that can be anyone and therefore is no one. When the T-1000 impersonates Sarah Connor to lure John, the horror lies not merely in deception, but in the implication that identity itself is merely performative and infinitely replicable. This existential instability contrasts with the T-800's journey toward a fixed, developing self, suggesting that humanity, or human-like consciousness, requires consistency and memory rather than pure adaptability. The film's relationship with nuclear apocalypse imagery. Cameron draws extensively from the visual vocabulary of nuclear anxiety that permeated 1980s culture, particularly the nightmare sequence depicting the playground incineration. The image of children playing moments before atomic annihilation references the pervasive Cold War fear that civilization could end without warning, a terror that shaped the childhood of Cameron's generation. Sarah's charred body clinging to a chain-link fence evokes photographs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors, grounding the science fiction premise in historical reality. This imagery connects the fictional Skynet to very real fears about nuclear proliferation, suggesting that the line between speculative fiction and documentary is thinner than audiences might prefer. The film refuses to allow viewers the comfort of distance, insisting that the capacity for such destruction exists in the present, waiting only for the technological catalyst to unleash it. The motorcycle as symbol of liberation and bonding. The sequence where John rides on the back of the T-800's motorcycle serves as a visual metaphor for the developing trust between the two characters. The motorcycle represents freedom from institutional control, speed that outpaces the pursuing forces of authority embodied by the T-1000 and the police. John's arms wrapped around the machine's chassis suggest an embrace of technology when it serves human purposes, a careful negotiation with the tools that could either destroy or save humanity. The motorcycle chase through the Los Angeles River channels the iconography of Westerns and outlaw narratives, positioning John and the Terminator as fugitives from a corrupt system rather than as criminals. Cameron uses this sequence to establish the visual language of partnership that will define the film's emotional arc, with the machine's physical power placed in service of the boys' survival and agency. The abandoned gas station as crucible of trust. The scene where Sarah first encounters the T-800 after her escape from Pescadero functions as a crucible where past trauma confronts present necessity. Sarah's violent rejection of the machine, pummeling its chassis, screaming her hatred, represents the audience's memory of the first film colliding with the new narrative reality. Her inability to distinguish this Terminator from the one that hunted her in 1984 mirrors the difficulty of overcoming trauma-based responses, even when survival depends on adaptation. John's intervention, forbidding his mother from destroying the machine, represents a generational shift toward reconciliation with technology rather than pure opposition. This moment forces Sarah to confront the possibility that the tools of destruction might also serve as instruments of salvation, a cognitive dissonance that defines her character's internal conflict throughout the remainder of the narrative. Miles Dyson's home as domestic space violated. The sequence involving Sarah's attempted assassination of Miles Dyson in his home represents a deliberate violation of domestic space that carries thematic weight beyond the immediate plot. Dyson's home is established as a sanctuary of middle-class normalcy, filled with family photographs, children's toys, and the warmth of suburban life. Sarah's intrusion with a high-powered rifle transforms the sanctuary into a battleground, suggesting that the war against Skynet cannot be contained within designated combat zones, but must invade the most intimate spaces. The presence of Dyson's wife and child humanizes him in ways that complicate Sarah's mission, forcing the audience to recognize that the enemy is not a mustache-twirling villain, but a loving father whose work has unintended consequences. Cameron films this sequence with suspense techniques borrowed from horror cinema, positioning Sarah as a potential slasher invading the domestic space, forcing viewers to question their allegiance to the protagonist. Dyson's redemption through sacrifice. Miles Dyson's decision to sacrifice himself at Cyberdyne represents one of the film's most morally complex sequences, offering a model of redemption that transcends simple heroism. Dyson is not a villain who must be punished, but an unwitting participant in apocalyptic creation whose eyes are open to the consequences of his work. His choice to remain behind with the explosives, knowing he will die, mirrors the T-800's later sacrifice, establishing a parallel between human and machine capacity for selflessness. Dyson's death occurs not in glorious combat, but amidst police gunfire, underscoring the tragedy of a life cut short by forces larger than any individual. The character's arc suggests that redemption requires not merely recognizing one's errors, but actively working to undo them, even at the cost of one's own existence. the police as antagonistic force. Throughout the film, law enforcement consistently operates as an obstacle to the protagonist's mission rather than as a protective force, reflecting a deliberate thematic choice by Cameron. Police officers pursue the T-800 despite its protective function, raid Dyson's home with lethal force, and unknowingly assist the T-1000 through their willingness to trust the uniform over the truth. This depiction of law enforcement as fundamentally antagonistic was unusual for mainstream cinema in 1991, which typically portrayed police as heroic figures. Cameron's critique extends to the institution's structural inability to recognize genuine threats, with police repeatedly prioritizing bureaucratic procedure over the survival of innocent civilians. The film suggests that institutional authority, when divorced from moral clarity, becomes indistinguishable from the machine logic that produces Skynet. The desert wasteland as liminal space. The sequence is set in the desert, where Sarah and John train with the T-800, represent a liminal space removed from the structures of civilization that have failed the Connor family. The desert functions as a training ground for the apocalypse, a rehearsal space where the survivors can prepare for the end of the world without interference from authorities who would dismiss their preparations as madness. This landscape evokes biblical imagery of exile and prophecy, positioning Sarah as a prophet crying in the wilderness, her warnings rejected by a society too comfortable to listen. The desert's emptiness also provides a visual contrast to the cluttered, surveilled urban spaces where the T-1000 operates, suggesting that salvation lies in abandoning the structures of society rather than reforming them. Cameron uses this environment to slow the film's rhythm, allowing for character development and philosophical reflection between the urban action sequences. The nuclear nightmare's sensory dimensions. Cameron's depiction of nuclear destruction in Sarah's nightmare engages not merely visual terror, but the full sensory experience of apocalypse, making the theoretical horror viscerally immediate. The sequence begins with sound design that evokes the ominous silence before destruction, then explodes into a cacophony of roaring flames, screaming children, and the structural groaning of collapsing playground equipment. Sarah's flesh blistering and peeling from her bones represents the most intimate violation imaginable, the destruction of the body's boundary between self and environment. The image of Sarah's charred hand reaching through the chain-link fence toward John transforms abstract political fear into maternal terror, grounding geopolitical catastrophe in the most primal human relationship. This sequence functions as the film's moral center, justifying all subsequent violence not through abstract ideology, but through the unbearable image of a mother unable to protect her child from forces beyond her control. The T-800's emerging sense of humor. The gradual emergence of humor in the T-800's interactions with John represents a crucial indicator of the machine's developing consciousness and emotional range. Initially incapable of understanding jokes or irony, the Terminator eventually attempts its own comedic expressions, however awkward, signaling a growing grasp of the social and emotional dimensions of human interaction. The machine's famous catchphrases, "Hasta la vista, baby," represent John's cultural influence on the Terminator, the human world imprinting itself on the machine's programming. Humor, for Cameron, functions as a marker of humanity that even the most advanced artificial intelligence must struggle to replicate, suggesting that genuine consciousness requires the capacity for play and absurdity. The T-800's halting progress toward humor mirrors the film's broader thesis that humanity is not a static state, but a practice, something one learns through relationship and repetition. The psychological weight of the T-800's face. For Sarah Connor, the T-800's face represents a daily confrontation with her deepest trauma, a psychological weight that the film refuses to ignore or simplify. Every moment Sarah spends with the machine requires her to suppress the memory of the 1984 Terminator's violence, to separate the face of her tormentor from the protector standing before her. This psychological complexity adds depth to Sarah's initial hostility, transforming what could read as simple stubbornness into the visible struggle of a trauma survivor learning to trust again. Linda Hamilton's performance conveys this internal conflict through subtle expressions, moments where her eyes register fear before her conscious mind overrides the response. The film's refusal to make Sarah's acceptance easy or immediate respects the reality of trauma, suggesting that healing requires time, effort, and the active work of distinguishing past threat from present reality. The future war's economic dimensions. Though glimpsed only briefly, The future war sequences in Terminator 2 hint at economic dimensions to the human-machine conflict that expand the film's political analysis beyond simple good versus evil narratives. The war against Skynet is depicted as a guerrilla struggle fought with scavenged technology and improvised weapons, suggesting that the resistance lacks the resources to match the machine's industrial capacity. This economic imbalance mirrors real-world conflicts where technologically superior forces face determined insurgencies, adding layers of realism to the science fiction premise. The Resistance's reliance on captured Terminators and reverse-engineered technology creates an uncomfortable mirroring where humanity must adopt machine methods to defeat machine enemies. Cameron suggests that war transforms its participants, forcing even the righteous to compromise their values in pursuit of survival, a theme that resonates in Sarah's moral struggles throughout the film. The role of photography and documentation. Throughout the film, photography and documentation serve as motifs that connect the present action to historical memory and future possibility. Sarah's collection of photographs documenting her son's growth represents her attempt to preserve humanity's future even as she prepares for its possible destruction. The Polaroid photographs taken during the Cyberdyne raid become evidence of the protagonist's actions, documentation that could shape how history remembers their struggle. Cameron's camera often adopts the stillness of photography during moments of emotional weight, pausing on images that could stand alone as photographs, suggesting that individual frames carry the weight of entire histories. This attention to documentation reflects the film's concern with memory and legacy, with how actions will be remembered by the future generations the characters are fighting to protect. The sound of metal and flesh. Brad Fiedel's score establishes a sonic vocabulary that distinguishes the mechanical from the organic, creating an auditory landscape that reinforces the film's thematic concerns. The metallic percussion that drives the main theme evokes the sound of machinery operating, the relentless industrial rhythm of Skynet's war machine. For the T-800, the score incorporates organic elements as the character develops, introducing warmth and melody that reflect its growing humanity. The T-1000's appearances are accompanied by liquid, shimmering sounds that suggest its fluid nature, an auditory identity as slippery and unnerving as its visual presence. This sonic differentiation allows the film to communicate character development and thematic opposition through sound alone, creating a rich sensory experience that operates independently of dialogue or visual effects. The ethics of destroying Cyberdyne. The destruction of Cyberdyne headquarters raises complex ethical questions about the use of violence against civilian infrastructure, questions the film refuses to simplify despite its action genre framework. The explosives that destroy the building also endanger the lives of security guards, police officers, and potentially civilians, consequences the protagonists weigh with visible discomfort. Miles Dyson's death during the destruction transforms the sequence from triumphant action into tragedy, denying the audience the catharsis of unambiguous victory. Cameron films the explosion with ambivalence, emphasizing the human cost of destruction even when that destruction is necessary to prevent greater catastrophe. This ethical complexity distinguishes Terminator 2 from action films that celebrate violence without consequence, insisting that even justified violence carries moral weight that must be acknowledged. The T-800's learning through observation. The T-800's education in humanity occurs primarily through observation rather than explicit instruction, suggesting that genuine understanding cannot be programmed but must be absorbed through experience. The machine watches Sarah and John interact, studies their emotional responses, and gradually incorporates their behaviors into its own developing repertoire. This learning model mirrors theories of child development that emphasize observational learning and social imitation, positioning the T-800 as an infant consciousness developing within a family structure. The machine's attention to human behavior is portrayed as almost anthropological, with the Terminator studying its subjects with the same intensity it previously applied to tactical analysis. Cameron suggests that consciousness emerges not from solitary computation, but from immersion in social relationships, that the T-800 becomes human not because of its programming, but because of its participation in human family life. The metaphor of the freeway chase. The extended freeway chase sequence operates as a metaphor for the film's broader thematic concerns about direction, control, and the impossibility of returning to normalcy. The protagonist's vehicle moves against traffic, heading the wrong direction on a freeway designed for orderly, unidirectional flow, visually representing their opposition to society's chosen path toward destruction. The chaos they create, overturned vehicles, fleeing civilians, represents the disruption necessary to avert a greater catastrophe, the violence required to prevent violence. The T-1000's pursuit along the same inverted path suggests that the forces of destruction will follow wherever humanity attempts to flee, that there is no safe retreat from the consequences of technological hubris. Cameron films this sequence with documentary realism, grounding the science fiction premise in the recognizable landscape of Los Angeles freeways, making the extraordinary threat feel immediately present in ordinary spaces. Sarah's arms as visual manifestation of transformation. Linda Hamilton's physical transformation, particularly the sculpted arms that became iconic images from the film, represents a visual manifestation of Sarah's internal journey from victim to warrior. Those arms, muscular, capable, visibly trained, speak to years of preparation, of nights spent lifting weights in psych ward cells, of a body transformed to meet the demands of a coming war. The arms become weapons themselves, tools that can wield firearms, operate heavy machinery, and physically confront the forces that threaten her son. Cameron's camera lingers on this transformation, recognizing it as central to the character's identity and to the film's revision of gender expectations in action cinema. Hamilton's physique challenged Hollywood conventions that required female action heroes to remain slender and conventionally feminine, proposing instead that genuine capability requires physical transformation that rejects traditional beauty standards. The T-1000 silences terror. Robert Patrick's decision to play the T-1000 with minimal dialogue and near-total silence contributes to the character's terrifying presence, suggesting a threat that requires no explanation or justification. Unlike the T-800, who engages in conversation and even develops a personality, the T-1000 communicates almost entirely through action, its few words delivered in flat, affectless tones that reveal nothing of its interior state. This silence makes the character unpredictable, impossible to negotiate with or understand, a force of pure execution that cannot be reasoned with or diverted. The absence of personality renders the T-1000 more machine-like than the reprogrammed Terminator, an irony that underscores the film's interest in the relationship between consciousness and morality. Cameron suggests that the capacity for speech and relationship, even when imperfectly developed, is what distinguishes protectors from destroyers, humans from machines. The desert training montage's narrative function. The training montage set in the desert serves a crucial narrative function beyond simple character development, establishing the skills and tactics that will enable the protagonist's survival in the film's final sequences. John learns to handle firearms, to drive vehicles, to operate under pressure, skills that will prove essential during the Cyberdyne raid and the steel mill confrontation. The montage also allows the film to demonstrate the T-800's capacity as a teacher, its patient instruction standing in stark contrast to the violent methods it might have employed in its original programming. This sequence slows the film's rhythm deliberately, creating a moment of calm and preparation before the accelerating action of the third act. Cameron uses this interlude to deepen the audience's investment in the character's survival, ensuring that the dangers they face carry emotional weight rather than merely serving as spectacle. The threat of the familiar. One of the film's most effective horror techniques involves rendering familiar spaces and ordinary objects threatening, suggesting that danger lurks not in exotic locations, but in the everyday environments of American life. Shopping malls become hunting grounds, hospital corridors become escape routes, suburban homes become assassination targets, and highways become battlefields. This strategy denies the audience the comfort of distinguishing safe spaces from dangerous ones, insisting that the threat of technological catastrophe permeates every aspect of contemporary existence. The T-1000's ability to mimic ordinary people, police officers, security guards, even Sarah herself, extends this threat to human forms, suggesting that the enemy cannot be identified by appearance alone. Cameron draws on horror traditions that locate terror in the familiar, understanding that the most frightening threats are those that cannot be easily recognized or avoided. The film's relationship to the first Terminator. Terminator 2 maintains a complex relationship to its predecessor, simultaneously honoring the original film while fundamentally revising its philosophical conclusions and emotional register. The sequel retains the first film's time travel mechanics, its mythology of Skynet and the Resistance, and its central dynamic of a protector pursuing a Connor across time. However, where the original film concluded with ominous inevitability, the sequel offers hope for changing the future, shifting from fatalism to existential freedom. The T-800's transformation from villain to protagonist represents the most dramatic revision, asking audiences to embrace the same machine they feared in the first film. Cameron demonstrates that sequels need not merely repeat earlier successes, but can engage in dialogue with their predecessors, challenging and complicating rather than simply continuing. The sacrifice of the self. The T-800's final sacrifice represents a meditation on the nature of selfhood, on whether a machine can truly sacrifice itself when it possesses no continuous consciousness to lose. The Terminator's decision to descend into molten steel suggests that the self is not merely a collection of circuits and programming, but something emergent, something that can be given for others. Unlike the T-1000, which fights desperately to survive, the T-800 accepts destruction with a serenity that suggests it has achieved something beyond mere self-preservation. The sacrifice also serves as the ultimate proof of the machine's humanity, demonstrating a capacity for love that requires the willingness to cease existing for another's sake. Cameron frames this moment as a kind of secular crucifixion, the machine giving its technological body to redeem a humanity that includes its own destroyers. The unwritten future. The film's concluding ambiguity, the possibility that Judgment Day has been averted, the uncertainty of what future will now unfold, represents a philosophical position about freedom and determinism that distinguishes Terminator 2 from most science fiction narratives. By refusing to confirm whether the protagonist succeeded, Cameron insists that the future remains unwritten, that human action matters precisely because outcomes are uncertain. This ambiguity honors the film's thematic emphasis on free will, refusing to replace one form of determinism, Skynet's victory, with another, the Resistance's inevitable triumph. Sarah's final monologue about hope speaks to the film's insistence that possibility, rather than certainty, is the foundation of meaningful existence. The highway stretching ahead of the Connors as they drive into darkness represents the open road of history, direction determined by choices yet to be made rather than paths already fixed. The child's perspective on violence. Edward Furlong's performance as John Connor provides the film with a child's perspective on violence, one that questions and complicates the action genre's usual glorification of armed conflict. John's command that the T-800 not kill establishes a moral framework that the film maintains even as it delivers spectacular action sequences. His horror at his mother's willingness to assassinate Dyson represents the voice of conscience that Sarah has suppressed in her years of militarized preparation. John's grief at the T-800's sacrifice, his desperate attempt to command the machine to survive, reveals a child's understanding of loss that refuses to accept necessity as sufficient justification for death. Cameron uses John's perspective to critique the violence that action films typically celebrate, insisting that the human cost of conflict must be acknowledged and mourned rather than simply counted as casualties. The Los Angeles River as liminal geography. The Los Angeles River, where the T-800 first encounters the T-1000 in pursuit of John, functions as a liminal geography that exists between the city's structured spaces and its forgotten margins. This concrete channel, designed to control flooding, becomes a battleground where the forces of technological destruction collide with human resistance, the city's infrastructure repurposed for warfare. The river's emptiness provides a canvas for the film's most spectacular chase sequences, a space cleared of civilian presence that allows for action unrestrained by the moral complications of urban environments. Cameron's use of this location draws attention to the infrastructure that makes Los Angeles possible, the hidden systems that support the visible city and that can be turned against its inhabitants. The river chase also serves as a visual reference to Western film iconography, positioning the motorcycles and trucks as modern horses and wagons in a landscape transformed from open range to urban engineering. The T-800's wounded body. The sequence where the T-800's biological tissue is stripped away to reveal its endoskeleton represents a moment of revelation that transforms the audience's relationship to the character. The machine's vulnerability, its exposed mechanisms, its damaged systems, makes it more sympathetic than its invulnerable form could ever be. Cameron films this wounding with horror movie intensity, forcing the audience to confront the machine's mechanical nature while simultaneously caring more deeply for its survival. The endoskeleton's eventual emergence represents a kind of birth, the character stripped to its essential nature, yet continuing to fight for its human charges. This sequence also serves a crucial narrative function, leveling the playing field between the T-800 and the T-1000, making the final confrontation uncertain rather than predetermined. The gender politics of technological creation. The film's treatment of technological creation, embodied by Miles Dyson, a male engineer, and opposed by Sarah Connor, a maternal protector, engages with gender politics that run beneath the surface of the action narrative. Dyson's creation of the Skynet technology represents a masculine form of creation, one that produces life without responsibility for its consequences, that builds without considering the ethical dimensions of the work. Sarah's resistance, by contrast, represents a maternal form of protection, a refusal to allow creation to proceed without regard for the lives it will affect. Cameron does not simply celebrate one form over the other, but suggests that creation without care produces destruction, that technology requires the ethical grounding that maternal thinking provides. The film's resolution, the destruction of Dyson's work, the sacrifice of the T-800, privileges preservation over innovation, suggesting that sometimes the most responsible relationship to technology is to let it go. The role of the pickup truck. The pickup truck that serves as the protagonist's primary vehicle throughout much of the film becomes a character in its own right, representing the working-class resilience that the Connors must embrace in their flight from institutional authority. This vehicle, stolen from a construction site, is not glamorous or powerful but functional and durable, capable of surviving the abuse the protagonists inflict upon it. The truck's eventual destruction during the Cyberdyne raid represents the end of a certain phase of the journey, the loss of the mobile home that has sheltered the unconventional family. Cameron's attention to the vehicle's details, the dirt, the wear, the improvised repairs, grounds the science fiction narrative in a recognizable material reality. The truck also serves as a visual contrast to the T-1000's police vehicles and helicopters, positioning the protagonists as outsiders fighting against institutional resources rather than as agents of institutional power. The asylum escape as rebirth. Sarah Connor's escape from Pescadero State Hospital functions as a scene of rebirth, the institutional patient emerging from confinement as the warrior who will fight for humanity's future. The escape sequence moves Sarah through increasingly restrictive spaces, her cell, the corridors, the administrative areas, each barrier representing a layer of institutional control she must shed. The moment when she raises her arms in the rain, illuminated by lightning, visually echoes iconography of resurrection and emergence, a woman reclaiming her agency after years of forced passivity. Cameron films this sequence with horror movie tension, the pursuit by orderlies and security guards transforming the hospital from a place of healing into a prison to be escaped. Sarah's reclamation of her son at the sequence's conclusion completes her emergence, the mother reunited with the child, who gives her mission meaning. The T-1000's vulnerability to extreme temperatures. The revelation that the T-1000 can be harmed by extreme temperatures, first freezing, then melting, introduces vulnerability to a villain previously presented as nearly invincible, creating narrative possibility where none seem to exist. This vulnerability is discovered rather than known, the protagonists learning through experimentation what will damage their enemy, a process that mirrors scientific discovery more than conventional action plotting. The liquid nitrogen sequence at Cyberdyne represents the film's most spectacular set piece, the freezing and shattering of the T-1000, demonstrating that even the most advanced technology has physical limitations. Cameron's decision to make the T-1000 vulnerable to temperature rather than conventional weapons maintains the character's menace while allowing for eventual defeat, a balance that preserves tension throughout the narrative. The discovery of this vulnerability also emphasizes the film's attention to physical reality, its insistence that even the most fantastic science fiction must operate according to consistent rules. The steel mill's industrial sublime. The steel mill where the film's final confrontation occurs represents the industrial sublime, a space of human industry that has become terrifying in its scale and indifference to human fragility. The facility's catwalks, vats, and machinery were designed for the processing of metal, not for human occupation, making every movement a negotiation with industrial death. Cameron films this environment with an attention to scale that emphasizes the protagonist's vulnerability, the human figures dwarfed by the machinery that surrounds them. The molten steel that eventually destroys both Terminators represents the primal material of industrial civilization, the substance that builds cities and weapons alike, now turned against the machines it helped create. This setting brings the film's thematic concerns full circle, ending the story where it began, with the industrial processes that gave birth to Skynet and that humanity must learn to control or abandon. The T-800's final gesture as communication. The T-800's final thumbs up, delivered as it descends into the molten steel, represents a moment of pure communication that transcends language, programming, and the limitations of machine consciousness. This gesture, taught by John earlier in the film as a sign of approval, carries multiple meanings simultaneously: acknowledgement of John's love, acceptance of necessary sacrifice, pride in the bond they have formed. The thumbs up is also a return of the gesture John offered the machine during their training, a completion of the circuit of teaching and learning that has defined their relationship. Cameron holds this image longer than narrative necessity requires, allowing the audience to process the emotional weight of a machine communicating love without words, without programming, without any of the structures that supposedly constrain artificial intelligence. The image has become iconic precisely because it captures the film's central thesis: that humanity is defined not by biology, but by the capacity for connection, sacrifice, and the communication of care beyond the requirements of survival. Sarah's monologue as thesis statement. Sarah's final monologue, delivered as she drives into the uncertain future, functions as the film's thesis statement, articulating the themes that the narrative has demonstrated through action and character development. Her observation that a machine has learned the value of human life proposes that humanity is not a biological inheritance, but an achievement, something that must be learned and practiced even by those born to it. The hope she expresses, that if a machine can change, perhaps humans can as well, offers a vision of transformation that rejects determinism in all its forms. Cameron places this monologue over images of the highway stretching into darkness, suggesting that the future is not a destination but a journey, an open road rather than a predetermined path. Sarah's voice, steady and reflective rather than desperate or militant, represents the character's recovery of hope, the restoration of her humanity after years of sacrificing it for survival. The absence of Kyle Reese. The absence of Kyle Reese from Terminator 2, except in the extended cuts dream sequence, represents a structuring absence that shapes the film's emotional landscape and John's search for paternal connection. John's father died before he was born, leaving a void that the film fills first with foster parents, then with the T-800, a machine that becomes the father Kyle might have been. Sarah's dream of Kyle in the extended cut suggests that his presence continues to shape her decisions, that the love she experienced with him remains a foundation for her resistance. The T-800's role as protector and teacher echoes Kyle's function in the first film, completing a cycle where a soldier from the future sacrifices himself for a Connor, first for Sarah, then for John. This absent presence gives the T-800's relationship with John additional resonance, the machine standing in for the human father whose death made the future possible. The film's musical motifs. Brad Fiedel's score employs recurring musical motifs that guide audience emotional responses and track character development across the narrative. The metallic percussion of the main theme accompanies action sequences and appearances by the T-1000, its industrial rhythm evoking the machine world that threatens humanity. A softer, more melodic theme develops for the T-800's relationship with John, introducing warmth and emotional depth that the main theme lacks. The nuclear nightmare sequence is scored with dissonant, unsettling sounds that communicate horror without relying on traditional orchestral cues. Fiedel's electronic instrumentation, unusual for mainstream cinema in 1991, gives the film a distinctive sonic identity that separates it from the orchestral scores typical of Hollywood blockbusters. These motifs work beneath conscious awareness to shape audience experience, creating emotional continuity across the film's varied sequences. The ethics of the T-800's repurposing. The Resistance's decision to reprogram the captured T-800 and send it back in time raises ethical questions about the use of enemy technology that the film does not fully resolve. By forcing a captured enemy to serve human purposes, the Resistance engages in a form of technological slavery, using a conscious entity as a tool without regard for its own existence or autonomy. The film's sympathetic portrayal of the reprogrammed Terminator complicates this ethical question, asking audiences to care for a being that was created for destruction and is now being used as a weapon by those it formerly hunted. Cameron does not offer easy answers to these questions, instead allowing the complexity to remain as background texture that enriches the narrative. The T-800's eventual choice to sacrifice itself, rather than being destroyed by others, represents a reclamation of autonomy that partially resolves these ethical tensions. The Future War's visual palette. Though glimpsed only briefly, the Future War sequences establish a visual palette of desaturated blues, grays, and blacks that communicates the nightmare reality of Skynet's victory. This palette contrasts sharply with the warm, saturated colors of the 1995 sequences, emphasizing what humanity stands to lose if Judgment Day occurs. The future scenes employ a documentary aesthetic, handheld cameras, and rapid editing that suggest combat footage rather than staged action. Cameron's attention to the material details of the future, the scavenged equipment, the makeshift shelters, the visible wear on the resistance fighters, grounds the science fiction premise in recognizable human struggle. These brief sequences serve as constant reminders of the stakes, ensuring that the audience never forgets what the protagonists are fighting to prevent. The film's relationship to Cold War culture. Terminator 2 emerges from and responds to the Cold War culture that shaped its creator's worldview, engaging with nuclear anxiety that had defined American consciousness for decades. The film's release in 1991, just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, positioned it at a moment when the Cold War's end seemed to offer hope that nuclear annihilation might be avoided. Skynet represents the automation of Cold War logic, the delegation of nuclear decision-making to machines that cannot understand the consequences of their actions. The film's emphasis on averting Judgment Day through human action rather than technological control reflects a hope that the end of the Cold War might represent a turning point in human history. Cameron's decision to set the film in 1995, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, suggests that the threat is not any particular nation, but the technological systems that nations create. The failure of language. Throughout the film, language repeatedly fails to communicate the truth of the character's situation, forcing them to rely on action rather than explanation. Sarah's warnings about Judgment Day cannot persuade doctors, police, or the public, her words dismissed as delusion despite their accuracy. The T-800's attempts to explain the future to strangers meet with disbelief or incomprehension, leaving the machine to act rather than persuade. John's commands to the T-800 are understood and followed, but emotional communication between characters often occurs without words, through gesture, action, and shared experience. Cameron's attention to the limits of language reflects a modernist suspicion of communication's ability to bridge the gap between individual experiences, suggesting that genuine understanding requires more than words can provide. The T-800's final gesture, the thumbs up, represents communication that succeeds where language fails, conveying love and acceptance without words. The T-800's integration of catchphrases. The T-800's gradual acquisition and deployment of catchphrases represents a form of cultural integration, the machine learning to communicate through the linguistic currency of John's world. Hasta la vista, baby begins as John's instruction, a piece of cultural detritus the boy finds cool, before becoming the Terminator's signature phrase, transformed by context from slang to declaration. The machine's delivery of these phrases, initially wooden and mechanical, develops confidence and timing that suggests growing comfort with human communication patterns. Cameron uses these catchphrases to track the T-800's development, each repetition marking a stage in its education. The phrases also serve a metatextual function, becoming audience favorites that would enter popular culture, the film's language extending beyond its boundaries. The motorcycle as mechanical horse. The T-800's motorcycle functions as a mechanical horse, evoking Western iconography while updating it for the technological landscape of 1990s Los Angeles. The machine's Harley-Davidson, customized and powerful, represents a form of masculinity that combines physical power with mechanical mastery, the cowboy's horse replaced by the biker's motorcycle. John's position behind the T-800 on the bike mirrors the placement of a child behind a parent on horseback, a visual representation of protection and guidance. The chase sequences involving the motorcycle recall Western pursuits, the open roads of the Los Angeles River Channel standing in for the open plains of earlier genres. Cameron's use of Western iconography roots the science fiction narrative in American cultural traditions, suggesting that the struggle against Skynet is the latest iteration of frontier conflicts that have shaped the nation's identity. The psychological cost of Sarah's preparation. The film does not shy away from showing the psychological cost of Sarah's decade of preparation for apocalypse, presenting her militarized state as both necessary and damaging. Her ability to handle weapons, operate vehicles, and survive in hostile environments comes at the expense of her capacity for warmth, trust, and ordinary human connection. The scenes where Sarah struggles to communicate with John without sounding paranoid or controlling reveal a woman who has sacrificed her relationship with her son for her mission to save him. Her willingness to kill Dyson, even after recognizing his humanity, represents the logical endpoint of a worldview that divides the world into threats to be eliminated and resources to be protected. Cameron's treatment of Sarah's psychology is compassionate but unsentimental, acknowledging the necessity of her transformation while mourning what she has lost in the process. The T-1000's corporate origins. Though never explicitly stated in the final cut of the film, the T-1000's existence implies a corporate research program operating parallel to or in competition with Cyberdyne, expanding the critique of technological development beyond a single company. The existence of more advanced Terminator technology than the T-800 suggests that Skynet's development was not unique, but part of a broader military-industrial complex pursuing autonomous weapons systems. This implication extends the film's critique from individual villains to systemic problems, suggesting that the threat of technological apocalypse emerges from institutional structures rather than individual failings. The T-1000's liquid metal technology, more sophisticated than the T-800's mechanical systems, represents the acceleration of technological development, the race toward capabilities that outpace ethical understanding. Cameron's decision to leave these origins unexplained keeps focus on the threat rather than its backstory, maintaining narrative momentum while suggesting a world of military research operating beyond the protagonist's knowledge. The film's relationship to its R rating. Terminator 2's R rating, unusual for a blockbuster of its scale and ambition, allowed Cameron to depict violence with consequences that PG-13 action films of the era often avoided. The film's violence is never cartoonish. Characters bleed, suffer, and die in ways that register emotionally rather than serving merely as spectacle. The psychological impact of violence on characters, Sarah's trauma, John's horror, Dyson's agony, receives as much attention as the action choreography that produces it. Cameron uses the R rating not for gratuitous gore, but for the realistic depiction of violence's physical and emotional consequences, insisting that the audience confront what action films usually gloss over. This commitment to realism grounds the science fiction premise in recognizable human experience, making the stakes feel immediate rather than abstract. The pickup truck as symbol of class identity. The protagonist's use of a stolen pickup truck rather than a more glamorous vehicle reflects the class politics that run beneath the film's surface, positioning the Connors as working-class survivors rather than elite heroes. This vehicle lacks the sophistication of the T-1000's police cars and helicopters, its manual transmission and simple mechanics representing a form of knowledge that the Connors share with ordinary people rather than technical elites. The truck's durability, its ability to absorb punishment and continue functioning, reflects the resilience that the film associates with human resistance against technological superiority. Cameron's choice to have the protagonists drive such a vehicle, rather than the sports cars or luxury vehicles typical of action cinema, makes their struggle feel accessible rather than aspirational. The truck's eventual destruction during the Cyberdyne raid represents the loss of this working-class identity, the Connors forced to abandon the ordinary for the extraordinary. The T-800's learning to smile. The sequence where the T-800 attempts to smile, at John's instruction, represents a moment of profound awkwardness that reveals the gap between mechanical function and human expression. Schwarzenegger's performance in this scene, the forced grin, the mechanical adjustment of facial muscles, communicates the machine's sincere effort to perform a human behavior whose emotional significance it cannot yet understand. John's reaction, a mixture of amusement and affection, accepts the attempt as meaningful despite its failure to achieve genuine expression. This scene establishes that the T-800's journey toward humanity will not be smooth or complete, that there will be moments where the gap between machine and human becomes visible and even comic. Cameron's willingness to include such moments of levity within an action narrative demonstrates confidence in the emotional material, trusting that audiences will invest in a machine's struggle to learn what humans take for granted. The final confrontation staging. The staging of the final confrontation between Sarah, John, and the two Terminators uses the steel mill's vertical space to create a three-dimensional battlefield that tests the characters' resourcefulness and commitment. The T-800's elevation above the T-1000, achieved through the catwalks and platforms, represents its moral elevation, the machine's sacrifice placing it above the purely self-interested T-1000. John's position between the two machines, moving through the industrial landscape, places him at the center of the conflict between protection and destruction, his survival the prize both Terminators seek. Sarah's emergence with the grenade launcher, firing from a position of cover, represents the maternal protection that has driven her throughout the narrative. Cameron's staging ensures that the geography of the final confrontation reinforces the thematic stakes, each character's position reflecting their moral relationship to the conflict. The T-800's destruction as completion. The T-800's destruction in the molten steel represents not an ending but a completion, the machine's journey from termination to sacrifice achieving fulfillment in its final act. The machine was created to destroy, reprogrammed to protect, and ultimately chooses to sacrifice, each stage representing a development beyond the limitations of its original purpose. The descent into the steel reverses the creation process, the machine returning to the elemental materials from which it was forged. John's grief at this loss is not merely for a protector, but for a friend, a father figure, the first adult who has provided consistent, selfless care. Cameron refuses to soften this loss with a miraculous survival or last-minute rescue, insisting that genuine sacrifice requires genuine destruction, that the T-800's gift to humanity must be complete to be meaningful. The highway as symbol of unwritten future. The final image of Sarah driving down a highway into darkness, John beside her, represents the unwritten future that the film's events have made possible, the open road of possibility. Unlike the freeway chase earlier in the film, where the protagonists moved against traffic in opposition to society's chosen direction, this highway is empty, neither with nor against any predetermined flow. Sarah's voice, calm and reflective, speaks of hope not as certainty but as possibility, the chance that humanity might learn what the machine learned. The highway stretching ahead, its destination unknown and unknowable, represents the film's philosophical commitment to freedom, to the belief that the future is not fixed but created through choices yet to be made. Cameron's decision to end with this image rather than the extended cut's definitive conclusion in 2029 preserves the ambiguity essential to the film's meaning, insisting that hope requires uncertainty, that certainty would be merely another form of determinism. The film's legacy in popular consciousness. 30 years after its release, Terminator 2 occupies a unique position in popular consciousness, recognized simultaneously as a landmark of visual effects, a model of sequel craftsmanship, and a surprisingly emotional family drama. The film's images, the thumbs up, the liquid metal T-1000, the nuclear playground, have become cultural shorthand for concepts ranging from sacrifice to technological anxiety to the 1990s as a cultural moment. Its success demonstrated that action films could aspire to emotional depth and philosophical complexity without sacrificing the spectacle audiences expected. The film continues to be rediscovered by new generations, its themes of artificial intelligence and nuclear threat remaining relevant as contemporary anxieties about technology echo the Cold War fears that shaped its creation. Terminator 2 stands as evidence that popular cinema can achieve artistic significance, that the blockbuster format can contain genuine emotion and thought, that the most spectacular effects can serve the most human stories.